Emily was a 12-year-old girl, small for her age, with big brown eyes that always seemed to be searching for something, perhaps a glimmer of hope amid the harshness of her life. She lived in a poor neighborhood in the Bronx, New York, an area filled with run-down buildings and alleyways she knew all too well. From a young age, she learned to survive on her own after her mother passed away. With no relatives willing or able to take her in, Emily was left to fend for herself. During the day, she walked the busy streets, trying to remain as invisible as possible among the bustling crowds. She made money by doing small jobs, sweeping the sidewalks for shop owners or helping people carry their groceries. When work was scarce, she would beg for change at the busier spots in the city, like near the subway stations or on the corners of major avenues. The people rushing by in their suits and ties hardly ever looked at her. She didn't enjoy begging. It made her feel small and worthless, but hunger and loneliness were harder to fight. At night, she found refuge in places the police rarely patrolled, using cardboard boxes she stashed away to keep warm and hidden. But even in these cold, uncomfortable places, Emily would dream. Despite the harsh reality of her life, her mind was filled with thoughts of a better future. She dreamed of having a home, going to school, and maybe even making friends. But most of all, she longed for a place where she felt safe, a place to call home. One afternoon, as she wandered through Zuccotti Park, a bustling area near Wall Street, Emily watched the crowds of people rushing by. She often wondered about their lives, what went on behind each face that hurried past her. To her, there seemed to be an unbridgeable gap between herself and them, a world as distant as the stars. Despite everything, Emily wasn't bitter. She didn't believe that everyone was bad. Maybe they just didn't see or didn't want to see the hardships happening around them. She often thought about what it would feel like to be truly noticed, not as just another homeless kid on the streets, but as a person who mattered. But those thoughts, like the stars, were beautiful yet far out of reach. Winter was beginning to make its presence felt, with the wind turning colder each day. Emily wore an old grey coat she had found in the trash months ago, too big for her, but it helped shield her from the cold. She hadn't eaten in over a day. The few dollars she had managed to save had already been spent, and work had been scarce. With her hands stuffed in her pockets, she walked slowly, trying to figure out her next move. That's when something shiny caught her eye, glinting in the fading afternoon sun. She bent down and picked it up, and to her surprise, it was a wristwatch. Not just any watch. This one was heavy, with small stones around the face that sparkled like diamonds. The light bounced off it, and Emily knew right away that this watch had to be worth a fortune. She looked around, searching for someone who might have dropped it, but nobody seemed to notice. For a moment, Emily thought about what she could do with something so valuable. She could sell it, and with the money, she could eat well for days. Maybe even find a warm place to sleep for a while. For a brief second, her mind filled with possibilities, but then another thought pushed its way to the surface. A feeling deep inside her that told her this wasn't the right thing to do. Emily knew what it was like to live with nothing, but she also knew that taking something that wasn't hers wouldn't solve her problems. Her mother had always told her, good things come to those who do the right thing. Even in her current situation, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had to return the watch. She held it firmly, feeling the weight of it in her hands, and started looking around the park, scanning the faces of the people walking by. The watch looked expensive, and whoever lost it must be someone important. Maybe, just maybe, if she returned it, they would reward her. Not with money, but at least with a thank you, a kind word. That would be enough to warm her heart, even if only for a moment. As she pondered her decision, the cold wind stung her face, reminding her of the reality she would return to. Giving the watch back wouldn't change her circumstances. She would still be hungry, still homeless, still struggling to survive. But something deep inside her, a sense of what was right, told her she couldn't keep it. Holding the watch a little tighter, Emily made up her mind. She would find the owner and return it. With the watch still clutched in her hand, Emily set out to find its owner. She wandered through the park, scanning the faces of people rushing by. She didn't know where to start, but she figured someone would eventually notice their missing watch and come looking for it. As she walked, her eyes kept flicking between the people around her and the expensive watch in her palm. She knew she stood out. A young girl in ragged clothes holding something so valuable would easily draw suspicion. Her heart raced as she moved toward the street. Just then, a tall man dressed in a sharp, dark suit was pacing frantically near a bench, talking loudly on his phone. His face was a mixture of frustration and panic. Emily hesitated for a moment, watching him from a distance. The man seemed to be searching for something, and her instincts told her he was likely the owner. She approached cautiously, stepping closer but still keeping her distance. She heard the man's conversation. "I can't believe this. That watch is worth more than most people's cars. How could I lose it?" he snapped, running his hand through his hair. Emily took a deep breath, trying to muster the courage to speak up. She was used to people ignoring her, or worse, yelling at her to leave, but she couldn't let fear stop her. This was the right thing to do, and she knew it. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man turned, his sharp gaze locking onto her. "What?" he barked, irritation clear in his tone. Emily flinched slightly but held out the watch. I think this is yours," she said, offering the shiny object in her hand. For a moment, the man just stared at her, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then his eyes flicked down to the watch. Recognition spread across his face, followed quickly by suspicion. He stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice low and accusatory. Emily blinked, taken aback by his tone. "I found it over there," she said, pointing back toward the area where she had picked it up. "I was just trying to return it to you." But the man didn't seem to believe her. His eyes were cold as they studied her shabby clothes, her worn-out shoes, her oversized coat. To him, she was just another street kid, someone who couldn't possibly be honest. His anger flared again. "Found it? Do you think I'm stupid?" he snapped, his voice rising. "You probably stole it and were waiting for a chance to sell it." Emily's stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't how she imagined things going. She thought she'd be thanked, not accused of theft. She shook her head desperately, trying to explain. "No, I swear, I didn't steal it. I just found it on the ground and—" "Liar," he interrupted, his face red with anger. "Do you have any idea how much this is worth? You should be ashamed of yourself." By now, a few people had started to stop and watch the commotion. Emily could feel their eyes on her, judging, assuming the worst, just like the man was. She felt her throat tighten, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? But the man wasn't interested in listening. He was already pulling out his phone again, his fingers moving quickly as he dialed a number. "I'm calling the police," he muttered, keeping his eyes on her. "Let them deal with this." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The police? She hadn't done anything wrong, but she knew from experience that people like her, poor, homeless, and without anyone to stand up for them, rarely got the benefit of the doubt. She didn't want to go to jail, especially not for something she hadn't done. She took a step back, her mind racing. Maybe she should run, disappear before the cops showed up here. But where would that leave her? Running would only make her look guilty, and the truth was, she didn't want to run. She wanted someone to believe her. Before she could decide what to do, a security officer who had been patrolling the area arrived, alerted by the man's raised voice. "What's going on here?" he asked. The man wasted no time. "This girl stole my watch," he said, pointing at Emily. "I want her arrested." Emily's world seemed to crumble around her as the security officer turned toward her, his hand already moving to the radio at his belt. Emily stood frozen as the security officer approached, his expression serious and unwavering. The man in the suit, Jonathan Steele, glared at her with a mix of anger and superiority. Emily could feel the eyes of passers-by on her, their judgment heavy in the air. She hadn't done anything wrong, But it didn't matter. She was the one being treated like a criminal. "What's the situation here?" the officer asked, looking from Jonathan to Emily. "She stole my watch," Jonathan repeated, pointing at the expensive timepiece in Emily's hand. "I want her arrested." Emily's throat tightened, panic rising inside her. "I didn't steal it," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "I found it. I was just trying to give it back." The security officer's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was trying to decide whether to believe her. But Emily knew how she looked. Dirty, ragged, just another homeless kid trying to survive on the streets. People like her weren't often given the benefit of the doubt. She had seen it happen before. No one cared to hear her side of the story. Jonathan scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Oh, please, you just happened to find it, huh? And you expect me to believe that?" The crowd around them had grown, and Emily could hear the murmurs of onlookers. They whispered among themselves, some casting glances her way, others shaking their heads. To them, the situation seemed clear. A rich man's expensive watch had gone missing, and a homeless girl had been caught with it. The assumption was obvious. "I was trying to do the right thing," Emily pleaded, her voice small against the noise of the city and the crowd. "I didn't want to keep it." But Jonathan wasn't listening. He turned back to the security officer, his voice firm. "I want the police called immediately. She's probably a part of some gang, stealing from people, and then playing innocent." Emily's stomach dropped. The idea of being part of a gang was absurd, but she knew it wasn't about the truth. It was about appearances. And to Jonathan and everyone watching, she looked guilty enough. The security officer hesitated for a moment, then reached for his radio. "I'll notify the police," he said, his tone professional but detached. To him, it was just another day on the job. Emily's mind raced. What could she do? She hadn't done anything wrong, but she had no proof, no one to back her up. Running would make her look guilty, but staying would mean facing arrest for a crime she hadn't committed. She opened her mouth to protest again, but before she could speak, a voice broke through the noise. "Wait," a woman said, stepping forward from the crowd. She was dressed in a sleek, tailored coat and carried an air of confidence. Her eyes flicked from Emily to Jonathan and then to the security officer. "Let's not rush to conclusions." Jonathan frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption. "And who are you?" he asked, his tone sharp. The woman offered a polite but firm smile. "Rachel Harrison. I'm an attorney," she said, pulling out a business card and handing it to the security officer. "I happened to be nearby and saw what was happening." Jonathan looked skeptical, but the security officer glanced at the card and then at Rachel, seeming to weigh his options. Rachel turned her attention to Emily, her expression softening. "Is what you're saying true? Did you find the watch and try to return it?" Emily nodded quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, I swear I didn't steal it. I just wanted to give it back." Rachel looked at Jonathan. "And you're sure this girl stole it? You didn't misplace it yourself?" Jonathan's face flushed with indignation. "I know exactly where I left it, and it wasn't on the ground for some street kid to pick up." Rachel remained calm. "I understand, but you have to admit there's no proof she stole it. It's entirely possible she's telling the truth." The security officer, sensing the tension, lowered his radio slightly. "Maybe we should wait for the police to sort this out." Rachel shook her head. "That won't be necessary. I think we can resolve this without involving the authorities." Jonathan folded his arms, his irritation growing. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Rachel turned to Emily, her gaze steady. "If you're telling the truth, you don't have anything to worry about, but I'd like to help you prove it." Emily blinked, surprised by the offer. No one had ever stepped in for her like this before. She wasn't sure what to say, but the warmth in Rachel's eyes made her feel a little less alone. Jonathan wasn't convinced. "Why are you getting involved in this? She's just a thief." Rachel's smile didn't waver. "Because I believe everyone deserves a chance to be heard. And if she's innocent, then she deserves to walk away without being labeled something she's not." Jonathan's mouth tightened, but he said nothing more. The security officer, seeming to take Rachel's side, put his radio away. "All right," he said. We'll hold off on calling the police for now. Relief washed over Emily, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen completely. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time. Someone was on her side. Rachel stepped closer to Emily, her eyes filled with quiet determination. The crowd had begun to disperse, though a few curious bystanders still lingered, watching the scene unfold. Emily glanced nervously at Jonathan, who was still fuming, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. But the presence of Rachel gave her a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this situation wouldn't end as badly as she feared. "I can help you," Rachel said softly to Emily, her voice steady and reassuring. "But I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you really find the watch, or is there more to the story?" Emily looked up at her, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "I'm telling the truth," she whispered. "I found it on the ground, and I was trying to give it back. I didn't want to keep it. I swear." Rachel studied Emily's face for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you." Jonathan let out an incredulous laugh, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "I don't have time for this." Rachel turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "Mr. Steele, I understand your frustration, but accusing someone of theft without proof is a serious matter. We need to be sure we're not punishing someone unjustly." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "She had my watch. That's all the proof I need." Rachel didn't back down. "Or she found your watch and did the right thing by trying to return it. Either way, calling the police won't make this any clearer. All it will do is drag out the situation and create unnecessary trouble." Jonathan's frustration was evident, but Rachel's logical tone seemed to have an effect. He paused, glancing at the security officer, who was now waiting for his cue on how to proceed. Rachel seized the moment. "How about this?" she suggested. "Instead of involving the police, why don't we try something simpler? Emily can work for you, Mr. Steele, as a way of making things right, whether or not she's guilty. If she's telling the truth, you'll see her character firsthand. If not, you'll have the chance to supervise her and prevent any wrongdoing." Emily's heart raced. The idea of working for the man who had just accused her of theft was terrifying. But she had no other options. It was that or face the legal consequences, and Rachel was clearly trying to protect her from the worst outcome. Jonathan looked skeptical. "You want me to hire her? A street kid? That's your solution?" Rachel nodded. "It's a fair compromise. She works, you get to keep an eye on her. And in the process, she gets a chance to prove herself. You're not out any money, and if she's as honest as she claims, you might even gain a loyal employee." Jonathan sighed heavily, his eyes flicking between Rachel and Emily. He seemed torn, clearly wanting to resolve the situation, but also unwilling to admit that the girl standing in front of him might not be a thief after all. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a frustrated breath. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped, "but I'm not going easy on her. She'll work hard, and if she messes up even once, she's out. Understand?" Emily nodded quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what kind of work he was talking about, but it had to be better than being arrested. Anything was better than that. Rachel smiled, relieved. "Thank you, Mr. Steele. I'm sure you won't regret it." Jonathan looked doubtful, but he didn't argue further. He turned to Emily, his expression stern. "You start tomorrow. Be at my office by 8 a.m. Sharp. If you're late, don't bother showing up at all." Emily nodded again, too afraid to speak. She couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. Just moments ago, she thought she was going to be taken away in handcuffs, and now she had a job, though the thought of working for Jonathan Steele was still daunting. Rachel reached into her bag and handed Emily a business card. "Here," she said. "This is my number. If anything happens or if you need help, don't hesitate to call me." Emily took the card, her fingers shaking slightly. She had never met anyone like Rachel before, someone who cared enough to step in and help a stranger without expecting anything in return. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel completely alone. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Rachel gave her a kind smile. "You're welcome. Just remember, you have to prove yourself now. This is your chance to turn things around." Emily nodded, understanding the weight of Rachel's words. She had been given an opportunity, but it wasn't a free pass. She would have to work hard and show that she deserved the second chance that had been offered to her. It wasn't going to be easy, especially with someone like Jonathan watching her every move. But it was a chance, a real one. Jonathan glanced at his watch, clearly eager to end the conversation. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said curtly, before turning and walking away. The security officer gave Emily a long look before stepping back and returning to his patrol, satisfied that the situation had been resolved. The crowd that had gathered had mostly dispersed, leaving Emily and Rachel standing alone on the sidewalk. Emily exhaled, the tension in her chest slowly easing. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she was safe. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The next morning, Emily stood outside the towering office building where Jonathan Steele's company was located. The sleek, glass-covered structure loomed above her, making her feel small and out of place. She tugged at the sleeves of her oversized coat, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked compared to the polished professionals walking in and out of the building. Her stomach churned with nervousness, but she knew she couldn't back out now. She had to prove herself, not just to Jonathan, but to herself as well. With a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into the brightly lit lobby. The interior was pristine, with marble floors and modern furniture that looked like something from a magazine. She felt everyone's eyes on her as she made her way to the front desk. The receptionist, a well-dressed woman with perfect makeup and a forced smile, looked at Emily with barely disguised suspicion. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but cold. I'm supposed to meet Mr. Steele," Emily stammered, shifting uncomfortably under the woman's gaze. The receptionist raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as she picked up the phone and dialed. After a brief conversation, she hung up and motioned toward the elevators. "He's on the top floor. Take the elevator on the right." Emily nodded, muttering a quick thank you before hurrying toward the elevator. Her heart pounded as she pressed the button for the top floor, the ride feeling both too fast and too slow at the same time. When the doors slid open, she stepped out into a hallway lined with glass walls and doors. Everything was spotless, organized and far too fancy for her comfort. At the end of the hall, she spotted Jonathan's office. He was sitting behind a massive desk, staring at his computer screen, looking every bit the part of a powerful businessman. Emily swallowed hard and knocked softly on the doorframe. Jonathan looked up, his expression unreadable. "You're on time," he said, his voice flat, almost as if he was surprised she had shown up at all. "That's a good start." Emily nodded, stepping into the office. She kept her hands clasped tightly in front of her, unsure of what to say or do. Jonathan stood up and walked around the desk, looking her over with a critical eye. "I don't have time for charity cases," he said bluntly. "If you want to work here, you'll have to earn your keep. No special treatment, no excuses." Emily nodded again. "I understand." Jonathan's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned and motioned for her to follow. "Come with me." He led her out of the office and down the hallway to a smaller room filled with cleaning supplies. "Your job is simple," he said, opening the door. "You'll be responsible for keeping the office clean. The floors, the windows, the bathrooms, everything. You do your job well and you'll get paid. If not, you're out. Got it?" Emily felt a mix of relief and dread. Cleaning wasn't glamorous, but it was something she knew how to do. She could handle this. She nodded. "Got it." "Good," Jonathan said, his tone still brisk. "You'll report to one of the managers for now. He'll show you around and make sure you know what to do." He pointed to a man standing at the end of the hallway, a tall, stern-looking man in a grey suit. "That's Mr. Davis," Jonathan said. "He'll be keeping an eye on you." Emily's heart sank. The way Jonathan said it made it clear that Mr. Davis wasn't just there to supervise, he was there to watch her every move, waiting for her to slip up. Mr. Davis gave her a quick once-over and nodded toward the cart of cleaning supplies. "Let's get started," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. As they moved through the office, Mr. Davis explained her duties. It wasn't complicated work, dusting, vacuuming, wiping down surfaces, but there was a lot of it. The office was huge, with several floors of employees, all of whom would expect everything to be spotless. Throughout the morning, Emily worked quietly, doing her best to stay out of the way. Most of the employees ignored her, but she could feel their eyes on her whenever she passed by. She could tell they were wondering who she was and why someone like her was working in such a high-end office. Mr. Davis watched her closely, rarely speaking but always nearby, as if waiting for her to make a mistake. Emily focused on her work, determined not to give him or Jonathan a reason to fire her. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, wiped down the windows until they sparkled, and cleaned the bathrooms with meticulous care. It wasn't easy work, but it was work. Something she hadn't had in a long time. By lunchtime, Emily was exhausted, but she felt a small sense of accomplishment. She had made it through the morning without any problems, and she hadn't given Mr. Davis any reason to doubt her. Maybe she could actually do this. As she sat in the small break room, eating the sandwich she had brought with her, she overheard a group of employees talking nearby. They were discussing Jonathan, complaining about how demanding he was and how impossible it was to impress him. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. If even his own employees found him difficult, what chance did she have? But then she remembered Rachel's words. This is your chance to turn things around. She couldn't afford to fail. Not now. Not when she was so close to proving that she wasn't just another street kid. She was better than that, and she was going to prove it, no matter how hard it was. As the days passed, Emily settled into her routine at the office. She worked hard, arriving early and staying late to make sure every task was completed to perfection. Her quiet determination didn't go unnoticed, but it didn't make life any easier. Most of the employees ignored her, while others eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She could feel their judgment in the way they looked at her, as if they were waiting for her to mess up. And then there was Mr. Davis. He was always around, watching her closely, his sharp gaze tracking her every movement. Emily could tell he didn't trust her. He was polite but distant, giving her instructions with the bare minimum of conversation. At first, she thought it was just part of his job to supervise and ensure she did her work properly, but over time, she began to sense that it was more than that. Mr. Davis didn't just watch her, he was waiting for her to fail. It became clear to Emily that Mr. Davis didn't like her. He viewed her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the pristine world of Jonathan Steele's company. She had overheard snippets of his conversations with other employees, subtle comments that made it clear he didn't believe she could be trusted. "She's just a charity case," he muttered to one of his colleagues when he thought she wasn't listening. "People like her always revert to who they really are. It's just a matter of time." The words stung, but Emily did her best to push them aside. She couldn't let people like Mr. Davis get to her. She was here to work, to prove herself, and nothing was going to stand in her way. Still, the tension gnawed at her. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how clean the floors or spotless the windows, she knew Mr. Davis was just waiting for the slightest mistake. And then, one day, she overheard something that made her blood run cold. Emily had just finished cleaning the break room and was on her way back to the supply closet when she passed Mr. Davis's office. The door was slightly ajar, and inside she could hear Mr. Davis talking to someone on the phone. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his voice carried into the hallway. "Yeah, I've got a plan," he was saying, his tone low and confident. "We'll make sure she slips up. Once she does, Jonathan will have no choice but to fire her." Emily froze just outside the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to listen without being seen. "No, it won't be hard," Mr. Davis continued. "She's desperate. All we have to do is push her a little and she'll crack. Trust me, I've seen it before. These kids always mess up eventually. Emily's stomach twisted with fear and anger. He was setting her up. Mr. Davis wasn't just waiting for her to fail. He was planning to make sure she did. He wanted her gone, and he was willing to do whatever it took to push her out. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do? She couldn't confront him. He was her supervisor, and no one would believe her word over his. And if he followed through on his plan, it was only a matter of time before she lost the job she'd worked so hard to keep. Emily knew she had to be careful. From that moment on, every step she took, every task she completed, felt like walking through a minefield. She could feel Mr. Davis's eyes on her more than ever, watching for the slightest mistake. She didn't know what he had planned, but she knew it was coming. The pressure was almost unbearable. Every time she entered a room, she wondered if something had been deliberately left out of place, waiting for her to miss it. Every time she cleaned a surface, she wondered if Mr. Davis had planted something that could incriminate her. The tension built inside her until she could barely sleep at night, worrying about what would happen the next day. Then, late one afternoon, she found something strange. As she was cleaning Jonathan's office, she noticed a stack of important-looking documents on his desk. One of the files had been pulled out slightly, as if someone had been rifling through them. Emily's heart raced as she realized what this could mean. If anything went missing or was out of place, she would be the first person they'd blame. She stood there for a moment, staring at the file, her pulse racing. This had to be part of Mr. Davis's plan. He was setting her up for failure, just like he had said. Emily had no idea how to stop it, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to get out of that office before things got worse. Emily rushed out of Jonathan's office, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't stay there any longer. Mr. Davis was setting her up, and she knew it was only a matter of time before things went terribly wrong. She had tried her best, worked as hard as she could, but it wasn't enough. In the end, people like Mr. Davis would always see her as a street kid who didn't belong. As she hurried out of the building, her mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. She couldn't go back to the streets. She had tasted the smallest glimpse of what it was like to be part of something, to have a job, a purpose, and she didn't want to lose that. But where could she go now? Rachel had said to call her if anything went wrong, but Emily wasn't sure if Rachel could fix this. Mr. Davis had already laid his trap, and the fallout was inevitable. The cold evening air hit her as she stepped outside, and she pulled her oversized coat tighter around her. The streets were bustling with people heading home from work, rushing to catch the subway or hailing taxis. She felt small and invisible again, just like before. Without thinking, Emily started walking aimlessly through the streets of New York, her mind clouded by the overwhelming sense of failure. She kept her head down, not really paying attention to where she was going, just needing to move, to escape from the weight of it all. She didn't know how long she'd been walking when she found herself in a quieter part of the city. The towering office buildings were replaced by narrower streets and dimly lit alleys. That's when she saw him. At first, she didn't recognize Jonathan Steele. He was standing in the shadows, talking to someone, a man Emily hadn't seen before. Something about the way they were talking seemed off. The man was standing too close, his body language aggressive, and Jonathan was backing away, looking tense. Emily froze, watching from a distance. The man grabbed Jonathan by the arm, and that's when she realized what was happening. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was a robbery. Her heart raced as she saw the glint of something shiny in the other man's hand, a knife. Jonathan was in danger. Jonathan was in. For a split second, Emily considered turning around and running. This wasn't her problem. She had enough to deal with already. But then another thought crossed her mind. If she didn't do something, Jonathan could get seriously hurt. No matter how badly he had treated her, she couldn't just stand by and let that happen. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and then ran forward. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the quiet of the alley. Both men turned to look at her, surprise flashing across their faces. The man with the knife snarled, his grip tightening on Jonathan's arm. "What do you want?" "A kid?" the man growled, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. Emily swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She wasn't sure what she was doing. She had no plan, no idea how to handle this, but she couldn't back down now. "Let him go," she said, her voice shaking slightly but filled with as much conviction as she could muster. The man laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You're out of your league, kid. Get lost before you get hurt." But Emily didn't move. She knew she was no match for this man, but she also knew she couldn't just walk away. She had to think of something, anything, to buy time. Jonathan, still struggling to free himself from the man's grip, looked at Emily, his eyes wide with fear. He seemed just as surprised as the thief by her sudden appearance. "Run," Jonathan muttered under his breath, his voice tense with urgency. "Just go." But Emily shook her head. She wasn't going anywhere. Desperate to distract the man, she glanced around and spotted a metal trash can nearby. Without hesitating, she grabbed the lid and hurled it toward the robber with all the strength she had. It wasn't much, but it was enough to startle him. The man flinched, loosening his grip on Jonathan for just a moment. "Now!" Emily shouted. Jonathan took the chance and shoved the man away, stumbling backward as he broke free. The robber cursed and lunged toward them, but Emily grabbed Jonathan's arm and pulled him toward the street. "Run!" she yelled again, this time directing the command at him. Jonathan, finally shaken into action, followed her, and the two of them bolted down the alley, their footsteps echoing against the walls. The man shouted something behind them, but he didn't give chase. After a few minutes of running, they emerged onto a busy street, the noise of the city swallowing the sounds of the alley. Jonathan bent over, gasping for breath, his face pale. Emily stopped a few feet away, her heart still pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had saved Jonathan Steele. For a moment, they stood there in silence, catching their breath. Then Jonathan straightened up, still looking shaken, but relieved. You saved me," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. He looked at Emily as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. Emily shrugged, still trying to calm her racing pulse. "You needed help," she said simply. "I couldn't just leave." Jonathan blinked, his face softening. I don't know what to say." Emily shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to respond. This was Jonathan Steele, the man who had accused her of theft, who had treated her with suspicion from the moment they met. And yet, here she was, the one who had stepped in when no one else had. "You don't have to say anything," Emily said quietly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Just stay safe." For the first time, Jonathan didn't have a sharp retort. He nodded, his expression unreadable. There was a long pause between them, and Emily wasn't sure if she should stay or go. She had done what she could, and part of her wanted to just walk away and disappear into the night. But something told her this moment wasn't over yet. Jonathan stood in the middle of the bustling street, still catching his breath from the ordeal. His eyes remained on Emily, but they were no longer filled with suspicion or anger. Instead, there was something else, an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Gratitude, even disbelief. Emily shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, unsure of what to do next. "I don't think I've ever been so wrong about someone," Jonathan finally said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Emily looked down at the ground, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected him to say that. After all, he had judged her from the beginning, just another kid from the streets who couldn't be trusted. It felt strange to hear an apology, especially after everything that had happened. "You didn't have to do what you did," Jonathan continued, stepping closer to her. "You could have walked away." Emily shrugged slightly, still avoiding his gaze. "It was the right thing to do," she said quietly. "I couldn't just let you get hurt." Jonathan paused as if he were struggling with the weight of his own thoughts. Then, after a moment, he spoke again, his voice filled with a sincerity she hadn't expected. "I misjudged you." "Judged?" Emily, I assumed the worst because of where you came from, and that was wrong. I see that now." Emily's eyes flicked up to meet his, surprised by the honesty in his words. She had never imagined hearing something like this from Jonathan Steele, the man who had been so quick to condemn her, so certain that she was nothing more than a thief. But here he was, admitting his mistake. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, his voice firm but genuine. "I've been unfair to you, and I'm sorry for that." Emily was silent for a moment, trying to process everything. She wasn't used to people apologizing to her, especially not someone like Jonathan. But deep down, she felt a small sense of relief, like a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the noise of the street. Jonathan nodded, his face thoughtful. There was a long pause, and then he spoke again, his tone more serious. "I want to make things right. You've proven yourself more than I ever could have imagined, and I don't just mean today." He hesitated, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I'd like you to come back to the office, but not as a cleaner." Emily blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What?" Jonathan cleared his throat, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "I have a few positions open that require more responsibility, something that would give you a real opportunity to grow. I think you've more than earned a second chance, and I want to offer you that chance, if you'll take it." Emily stared at him, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected this. All she wanted was to survive another day, to keep her job, and stay out of trouble. But now Jonathan was offering her something more, something she hadn't dared to hope for. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice shaky. Jonathan smiled, a small but genuine expression. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just think about it." The two stood in silence for a moment longer, the noise of the city swirling around them. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Real hope. She had always believed that she was capable of more, but no one had ever given her the chance to prove it. Now, Jonathan was offering her that chance. Emily nodded, a small smile creeping onto her face. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady. Jonathan extended his hand. "Whenever you're ready, my door is open." Emily shook his hand, still feeling a little unsure of what the future held, but for the first time, she knew that the possibilities were endless, and this time she wasn't going to let them slip away. Weeks had passed since that night in the alley, and Emily's life had changed in ways she never thought possible. Jonathan Steele had kept his word, offering her a position at the company that went far beyond just cleaning. She was now working as an office assistant, learning the ins and outs of the business world, something she had never imagined for herself. Every day was a new challenge, but Emily faced each one with determination. She worked hard, eager to prove that she belonged, not just to Jonathan, but to herself. The other employees were slowly warming up to her, especially after hearing about what had happened that night. She wasn't just a street kid anymore. She was part of something bigger, something that felt like a real opportunity. Rachel Harrison had stayed in touch, offering guidance and support whenever Emily needed it. She had become a mentor of sorts, helping Emily navigate the complexities of her new life. With Rachel's encouragement, Emily had also enrolled in evening classes at a local community college. She was determined to continue her education, to make the most of the second chance she had been given. Sitting at her desk one afternoon, Emily looked out the window at the bustling city below. The view from the office was incredible. New York stretched out before her, alive with energy and possibilities. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, she had been living on the streets with no hope of escaping the cycle of poverty and hardship. But now, everything was different. She had a job, a mentor, and for the first time in her life, a real sense of purpose. She was building a future for herself, one step at a time. Jonathan Steele had changed too. He was no longer the cold, dismissive man who had once accused her of theft. He had become a supportive figure in her life, offering guidance and advice when needed. The two of them had developed an unexpected bond, built on mutual respect and the lessons learned from their past mistakes. Jonathan had even started talking to Emily about more long-term goals, helping her set up a plan for her career and encouraging her to think about her future in ways she had never considered before. As Emily packed up her things at the end of the workday, she felt a sense of pride that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had come so far from where she started, and the future no longer felt like something to fear. Instead, it was something to look forward to, a future full of possibilities. Before leaving, she glanced back at the office one more time, taking in the sight of the place that had become a turning point in her life. It wasn't just about the job. It was about the journey that had brought her here, the people who had helped her along the way, and the new beginnings that awaited her. As she stepped out onto the busy street, Emily smiled. This was only the beginning.